are hybriding this event. We have, I hope, online Madeleine Sumption from the Migration Observatory. Oscar, is that all sorted out? Will we be able to see Madeleine? Okay. Well, I'll just quickly introduce everybody. On the far right is Robert Jenrick, Minister of State for Immigration, and somewhat to his left is Matthew Goodwin, Professor of Politics at Kent and general troublemaker in the public conversation, and actually now a very successful, what do we call you, blogger? You're Substacker. How you have hundreds of thousands of readers, don't you? Getting there. And to my immediate right is Lord Hodgson, who has long taken interest in demographic matters, and coming in online we have, I hope, Madeleine Sumption, who I mentioned, who is head of the director of the Migration Observatory at Oxford. Well, I think I won't give a great introduction. Obviously, we know migration's gone right back up to the top of the list of public anxieties, having dipped down briefly after Brexit and the ending of free movement. But it's been steadily climbing back up, partly I assume as a result of the boats across the Channel, but also because of the really pretty dramatic increase in legal migration in the last year. World record of 606,000 net migration, and a Conservative Party, obviously traditionally a party of immigration restriction, finding itself outflanked by the traditionally more immigration open Labour Party. A lot of problems and issues to discuss, including this issue that is often, I think, quite properly raised in this context, which is that although, as I said, the overall scepticism about hostility to large-scale immigration has been bouncing right back up again into the 60% and higher. When people are asked about specific reductions to immigration, they often find it hard to specify, or rather, turning it the other way around, that they tend to favour many of the forms of immigration that are currently happening, particularly work immigration that is focused on health and social care. So hopefully we will touch on that issue too. You know, what are the areas of immigration that could be reduced, you know, without a big cost and without being unpopular. Everyone's going to speak just for a few minutes. So why don't we start with you, Minister?
Well, thank you, David, for hosting this event and for all the good work that Policy Exchange does on this incredibly important topic. And I think you're right to introduce the question of legal migration as one which is as important as the question of illegal migration. And many of the issues that we speak about with respect to illegal migration are just the same, or even more so, with respect to legal migration. So the number of people coming into this country does place huge pressure on housing supply. It places huge pressure on public services, and it places huge pressure on our ability to integrate people and to form a united and cohesive society. And it's for all those reasons and others, I think we have a serious obligation upon us now to get control over the legal migration system, make changes where necessary, and do what the public have asked us to do as politicians for decades now, which is to reduce the number of people coming into the country to a sustainable level. The big reform that we as a government have achieved has been Brexit. Brexit gave politicians like the Home Secretary and I the levers which we can pull to control our legal migration system. And I think that that will be proven in the years ahead, and it has already, to be absolutely the right thing, because we are living in an age of mass migration, not just the illegal migration that you see vividly in the UK and the southern border of the United States, in Lampedusa, in Italy, but legally as well. You see tens, if not hundreds of millions of people on the move throughout the world looking to come to developed countries like the UK, where their economic prospects would be better. And we have to have control over the levers to ensure that we can protect our borders, our sovereignty, and make intelligent choices about who comes in for what reasons. Where I think we've gone wrong is that immediately after leaving the EU, we established a legal migration system that was, if anything, more liberal than the system that we had when we were in the European Union. And that, in the intervening period, admittedly one in which the kaleidoscope has been shaken by COVID, the movement of people initially paused and then opened again, the war in Ukraine and other major factors, but a system which has driven very large numbers of people to come to the UK perfectly legally. And now is the right time, I think, to appraise that, to make changes, and to create a sustainable system for the future. That's what the Prime Minister, the Home Secretary and I are setting out to do. You've seen some reforms already. We made a significant one earlier in the year with respect to dependents, people coming to university and bringing their family members with them, often as a backdoor to life in the UK rather than for education purposes. But it's clear to me that further substantial changes are going to be necessary. The last thing I would say is that we have, as a country, had an economic model for many years now, which has been dependent on low and mid-skilled people coming in. And that has not led to higher productivity. It's not generated higher GDP per capita. If it did, we would be one of the richest countries in the world. We need to acknowledge that very large levels of low and medium skilled migration is not a sustainable path to prosperity. Prosperity is formed through embracing technology and automation. It's formed through better skilled training for our domestic workforce. It's formed through investing in infrastructure that can help to transform the economic prospects of parts of the country. The model that we've adopted as a country is not working, and we can't continue it. And that's why we do need now to finish the revolution that we started with Brexit by not just taking back control of those levers, but actually exercising them so that we can make our own intelligent choices and reduce the amount of legal migration into the country.
Thank you. Matt?
Thank you, David. I have mixed feelings about being described as a troublemaker, because I think actually what I'm just doing is communicating how voters out there are thinking and feeling about this issue. And the reality is that many voters are deeply concerned about the scale and the speed of immigration and demographic change in Britain. The vast majority of voters, as David said, now think that immigration has been too high over the last decade. They consistently back reductions. More voters back the Rwanda policy than oppose it. Only this week, as I wrote on Substack, 66% of voters agree with Suella Braverman's suggestion that uncontrolled and illegal migration is an existential challenge to the West. 69% think the small boat crossings have put unsustainable pressure on the UK asylum system and British taxpayers. 58% believe that people who choose to cross the channel illegally are showing contempt for British laws, and 70% think that the government needs to act now. So the concern is clearly visible, and I'm afraid I don't buy much of the narratives many of the narratives that we have in SW1 about immigration. I think consistently the expert class, the elite class, is misinterpreting data on migration, partly to reflect their own ideological priors. And what I'm really concerned about today is the collapse of public confidence in the immigration system. If you ask voters who do they trust on immigration, as you will have seen in the Times recently, on the surface, the answer is the Labour Party, because the Labour Party is ahead of the Conservatives. But actually, if you look closer at the data, the answer is none of them. The vast majority of voters in this country no longer back any of the major parties on immigration. That is how much the establishment have failed on this issue. No confidence in the system, no confidence in the asylum system, frustrated and disillusioned, partly because they thought Brexit was going to bring control, but also because they no longer believe that the state is capable of responding to this issue. How much immigration do people want? If you look at the research in political science, my discipline, the best study that I think we've got by colleagues at the LSE suggests that voters typically want around 100,000 net migration, about 100,000, 150,000, certainly not 600,000 plus. So there's clearly a disconnect between public opinion on the one hand and the policy delivery on the other. And looking ahead, my last comment, because I've been doing some polling on this, what also concerns me, apart from the collapse of public confidence in the system and the disillusionment and the apathy, is the complete lack of planning and preparation for how this is going to unfold in the future. And David mentioned some of the stats at the beginning, but one sticks out to me: about 40 million people in Africa and the Middle East say the UK would be their preferred destination. As I wrote this week, we're only at the beginning of the global migration crisis, certainly nowhere near the end. But there is a remarkable lack of planning in terms of how this population change is going to impact housing, NHS, public services, schools, social cohesion, which obviously, as we saw recently in Leicester, remains a very pressing issue, yet we don't even talk about integration and cohesion anymore. Community cohesion and social integration have sort of just disappeared from our political debate. So I've been polling voters and saying, well, could we actually think about, at least at a bare minimum, having some kind of office, some kind of department that would do a better job at planning how this population change is going to unfold? And unsurprisingly, voters firstly say they're surprised that that doesn't really exist. We look at the economic effects of migration, but that's basically it. And secondly, they are very supportive, 70, 80%. And I know Lord Hodgson's been working on some of this very closely, but 70 to 80% of voters say they want much more work being done looking at how this issue is going to unfold. So finally, as you can tell, I'm deeply concerned about where we are on the issue. Disillusionment is very palpable, and this will have political effects, either in terms of apathy or in terms of taking us all the way back to the early 2010s, where we saw the rise of Nigel Farage and so on, because we've clearly not learned any lessons over the last 13, 14 years. So I will finish there. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt mentioned that you've been thinking about some demographic institutions.
Yep.
Tell us more.
Yep. Just a bit of background first. As the chairman has said, the argument before us is how much immigration is too much. Another way of saying how many people are too many people. And when you come to think about how many people we can absorb each year, two things important to remember. One is that we are an island already very crowded. England is already more crowded on a per capita basis than the Netherlands. And remember also, when you think of the number, that our natural population, our natural increase is still positive. We still have 100,000 roughly excess of births over deaths, which have to be absorbed and looked after and provided with housing and so on and so forth. Those need to go into the mix when you come to think about the numbers. And the last preliminary point is the question of illegal migration. Of course, the government is absolutely right. Robert Jennings is absolutely right. We had the illegal migration with the Lords. I spoke in favour of it. Not a popular thing to do in their Lordship's house. I was told by no less a person than the Archbishop of Canterbury that I was unkind and unpleasant, but I've survived. But with those preliminary points, the first question is, what is the big event? The big event is, as the chairman has told us, 606,000 people given right to remain permanently here last year. What do 600,000 people look like? Well, if you think of Swindon, Derby, Stoke-on-Trent, Southampton, they're all cities with about 300,000 in them. So you're thinking about 2 Swindons, 2 Southamptons, 2 Derbys to cover the people who came here last year. This has been going on, as the chairman said, for some time, and there appears to be no reason why it should slow in the future. Why has this happened? Well, it's happened for 2 reasons. One is that the moral argument that we need to take in more people, we owe it to people who are so badly off, we need to help more of them. Nobody quite says how many, but they say that. And secondly, the question of the economic arguments, which again the chairman and indeed the minister referred to. But you might like to know that in order to work in this country, you need a national insurance number. And last week I had to answer a parliamentary question. How many national insurance numbers, or NINOs, did we issue in the year to 31st of March last year? 1,100,000. So we have a system that allowed 600,000 people in here permanently and 1.1 million people here to work temporarily or maybe permanently. And that must be a system that is completely out of control, as the minister has really admitted in many ways. So there is work to be done to deal with these particular issues, because behind all this, as Matt has pointed out, there's a mass of our fellow citizens who are really concerned about what this means in various ways for them and the future of their children and grandchildren and their communities. So how do we disentangle all these difficult things, and how do we give proper weight to those issues? Remember the famous Robert Kennedy phrase, which was, GDP measures almost everything except those things that make life really worthwhile. So how do we get that into the mix? Well, one answer would be to have what I call the Office for Demographic Change. If you prefer to have the title Office for Population Sustainability, that's fine by me. I'm not stuck on the title. And how would it work? Well, you would have a statutory body, like the Office of Budget Responsibility, set up, and it in turn would have within it a council big enough to be representative of this particular problem and the interest groups, not so big it becomes a talking shop. And it would be statutorily independent and would be able to commission research and comment and be properly staffed. The second part is the government every year would have to produce a charter for demographic change. And the government would have to say, this is what we think the population of this country will grow over the next 5 years, the short term, how much in the medium term, 5 to 15 years, and how much the long term, 15 years plus. And having said that, they would have to say, what do we think will be best for the country? And if those 2 numbers don't match, what policies we're going to introduce to make sure they come together and meet. Now, the ODC would then comment on this in the broadest sense. How has the government fulfilled its charter obligations about the environment, about ecology, about economy, about society, treaty obligations, food and water security, and will produce a report for every year for debate in Parliament. And this would bring 3 really important things. It provides a forum in which we can discuss this very difficult and highly toxic matter without everybody losing their temper and taking very extreme positions. It would require governments to be honest. No more kicking the can down the road saying, good Lord, was that the number last year? Now they'll have to say in advance what they think it should be and what they're going to do about it. And then last, and most importantly, we'll be reassuring the 60, 70, 80% people that Matt has referred to in his talk, that we are concerned. We understand their worries, and we are going to try to do something to help restore, in a small way, democratic trust and belief in the system, And if you ask me about it, I would say this, wouldn't I? I would say this would be an excellent way to differentiate ourselves from the Labour Party in our forthcoming election manifesto.
Thank you very much. Okay, now let's see the technology is going to work. Is Madeline there? Yes, I can see Madeline's smiling face.
Hello, can you hear me as well?
Over to you. I can hear you too. Good.
Excellent.
Bonus.
Well, thank you for allowing me to join remotely. So I thought I'd just say a few things about the trajectory for immigration over the next few years, because this period has been quite unusual with record high levels of net migration. I think it's reasonable to assume that those net figures are going to come down, at least to some extent, even without big policy changes. We've already, Ukrainian migration is already down, British nationals overseas a bit. And probably more importantly, we're expecting an increase in emigration of international students because the number coming in effectively, the last 1 to 2 years has been higher. And most of those people, at least in the past, have tended to stay for shorter periods. So I think it's reasonable to assume numbers will come down, but not necessarily to levels that are any lower than in the pre-Brexit period. So still that, what historically has been quite high levels of net migration. The big uncertainty, I think, when thinking about the trajectory is work-related migration. So if I'm right that Ukrainians and students' contribution to net migration will decline, then instead of thinking by 2025, 2026, we'd expect actually the largest contribution to net migration to be coming from work. Now, 2022, it looks like total work migration to the UK was probably actually broadly similar to the pre-referendum peak, although the data aren't entirely comparable. And that's basically because you've had a large drop in EU work-related migration, but a big increase in non-EU. And one of the reasons for this is that you've had, despite the end of free movement, there's been a huge increase in the number of people getting work visas for the health and care sector. So I think one of the key points here is that you can't really have a conversation about desirable levels of net migration without a serious conversation about work visas, and particularly about health and care. So in terms of what is a desirable level of net migration, here I would make 2 points. The first, I think it's just a real challenge that it's quite difficult to specify this sort of technocratically. I think there's sometimes an assumption that clever technocrats can tell you what the right level is. Economists actually tend not to have strong views on the right level of migration, partly because the economic impacts of migration are very sensitive to who is coming, perhaps more than the numbers themselves. But partly also because you can't really set the desired level of net migration in isolation from other policy choices, whether that's about the routes themselves, so the specific routes on work, study, family, humanitarian migration, or on the other policy responses, so the kind of planning that Lord Hodgson and Matt Goodwin have mentioned. So an example here, take the care visa. If you want to reduce net migration, one option would be to close the care worker route, which has admitted in numbers of people over the last year in the high tens of thousands. Now, the consequences of doing that depend a lot on what else you do. So you could change nothing else and potentially risk quite serious staffing problems in the social care sector, the kind that they have experienced over the last few years. Or you can spend substantial sums of money on care, improving paying conditions, which in a difficult fiscal environment is not necessarily an easy option either. But I think those are the kinds of sort of more fine-grained conversations that need to be had in order to think about what is a good level of net migration in the UK. 2 final observations that are crucial, I think, when thinking about the policy and politics of immigration levels, which is firstly that some types of migration are just more amenable to policy change than others. So work and study are relatively easy to influence through policy changes, much more so than family or asylum. You've got relatively straightforward policy changes that can influence work migration, for example, and that also has a knock-on impact on study migration. That's much less the case for asylum. And finally, I think on thinking about targets in particular, it's much harder than many people think to predict the level of migration the particular set of policies is going to give you. And that's because the numbers actually fluctuate over time, even when policy is exactly the same. And what this means is I think that absolutely political parties can make choices about whether the UK should be a more restrictive or more liberal country towards immigration in the medium term, and that will affect numbers, of course. But it is quite hard to guarantee, with a particular set of policies, how many people are going to take them up from one year to the next, which means that there's some trial and error in terms of, introducing a policy and then seeing what happens. And that it is very difficult to say, we guarantee this number of people in 2024, even if you can actually have quite a big influence over numbers of, over a long period of time.
Good. Thanks, Madeline, and thanks to all of our speakers for some very clear contributions and to time, broadly speaking. Let me just, a couple of sort of factual things have emerged. So, Madeline, you talked about work visas. In the last year, we've had, about 200,000 people have come in on work visas, is that right? But probably about half of that health and social care. Is that roughly right?
It depends whether you include, so if you include the dependents as well, then it's much higher. I think including dependents, it's about 200,000 for health and care alone, and then you have the additional other visa categories. Yeah,
but
then it depends which ones you include.
We also have this figure of 1.1 million new national insurance numbers. So where are the rest? Where's the 800,000 new national insurance numbers coming from? Is that just people who are already here, who are moving from non-work to work?
Yeah, so most, and this I think is really interesting when talking about the labour market, is that most of the people who have come to the UK over the last year are not main applicants on work visas. So Ukrainians are allowed to work. Many of them will have national insurance numbers. Dependents of students also working. So the numbers of national insurance numbers we actually expect to be much higher than the number of work visa.
Right. So quite a lot of that 1.1 million will be a direct or indirect result of immigration. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. One thing that you said, Lord Hodgson, which I don't think is correct, you said that 600,000 people are here permanently.
That remain.
No, that is not true. And this is one of the things that I'm slightly obsessed with in the immigration debate, is that we do not, we focus a huge amount on the net migration number, which is a churn number. I mean, that 600,000 number is mainly composed of people who are not going to be here permanently. A very large chunk is refugees who are going to return at some point anyway, or students, 99% of whom return unless they move to another channel, obviously, unless they move onto work, but a very large proportion. So the number of people who claimed permanent residence last year in this country was, I think, around 130,000. And that, I think, is a figure that we should have a great deal more focus on, because there is so much churn in these frighteningly high net migration numbers, 600,000. I mean, the thing, as Lord Hodgson and Matt and others have said, the thing that people are legitimately anxious about is the over-rapid demographic change to the country. And what matters in that is the permanent residence number. Now, obviously, there are effects, there are pressures on housing and the health service and so on from people who are only here for a few years. So that's not irrelevant, not to be discounted. But we're very unusual as a country in our focus on the net migration figure. I met a German MP, a CDU MP who came over recently, who takes a specialist interest in immigration matters. And I said to him, what was the net migration figure to Germany last year? He had no idea. They don't focus. I'm not saying that we shouldn't focus on it, but we're quite unusual in the extent that we focus on that figure that picks up so much of the noise of the churn of the students, and indeed a lot of the work migration, which is not permanent as well. And it's the same in America. The only debate is really about irregular entry across the Mexican border. There isn't really very much debate about legal migration. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't. We should obviously have a debate about legal migration, but I think it is just worth remembering how misleading in some ways the net migration figure can be from the point of view of permanent change to the country. and as Madeline said, I think that figure is going to decline very sharply. I mean, it's one of the kind of political ironies is that it's probably the case that that Keir Starmer and a Labour government are going to appear to be effectively bringing downward pressure on migration. I mean, no thanks to anything they do. If anything, they're probably going to liberalise, in here and there. But the numbers will come down, but partly because a lot of it was one-off factors. Ukraine, there was a lot of pent-up desire for higher student numbers and so on and so forth. Anyway, that's my little rant over. But I do think, I mean, and I'd be interested, Minister, in your thoughts on whether we could, I mean, just going back to the famous David Cameron 100,000. I mean, if that number had been permanent residents rather than net migration, he'd have knocked it out of the park every year. I mean, the number's only just gone over 100,000 for permanent residents. I mean, do you not think that there is something in focusing more on that permanent residence number rather than the rather more arbitrary net migration figure?
Well, I think that's an interesting point, David. I think you perhaps overstate it, because anyone who comes to spend a period of time in this country does put pressure on public services and above all on housing. And we can't be blind to that. There is a chronic shortage of housing in this country. And if you look at what's happening to rents in our biggest cities, where many of the people coming in as migrants are going to live, including somewhere like Manchester, that is making it extremely difficult for people to get good quality housing. And so you may well be right that a proportion of the 600,000 will not seek to live in the UK permanently, but nonetheless having 600,000 net individuals coming to the UK every year is exacerbating some of the very serious problems we face as a country, like access to public services, like housing. I also think that some of the things we've seen in the past may not be good indicators of the future. So, for example, the very large numbers of students coming today, I think a higher proportion of them will choose to make a life in the UK than we saw a few years back, partly because the mix of nationalities of those students is different, and so people will come, partly because, at least until we made the changes we did earlier in this year, a much higher proportion were bringing dependents with them, which suggests that they are probably more likely to put down roots in the UK if they live here with their children and partners for a period of time, although this is all speculation. We'll have to see what happens in the years ahead. So I do think that net migration is a good measure. There are other measures that you can pay attention to, and perhaps the debate is artificially focused on how you cut the figures, which, as Madeline said, are inherently uncertain, and policy choices, it's never easy to monitor what will happen as a result of them. But I think my central argument is that nonetheless, it's clear that by historic standards, very large numbers of people are coming into the country, and that is unsustainable. And I also question how useful that is, certainly from an economic perspective, because if the argument was that having such large levels of migration was leading to higher GDP per capita and prosperity, I think the evidence suggests that's just not correct. So we need to make more careful and intelligent choices about who comes into the country and not allow just such large numbers of lower skilled or mid-skilled at best migration.
Right. Well, let me ask all four of you, before opening it up to the floor, where would your priorities be for reducing that 600,000 number, over the next few years? We've done student dependence has been partly dealt with. I mean, where do you see the other areas that would be, as it were, least unpopular, have least sort of knock-on effect in negative ways?
Well, it's difficult for me to speculate on the sort of things we're talking about. But, I mean, things that stand out to me in the numbers are the fact that we are bringing in quite a large number of people who are lower skilled. And the current salary threshold that the points-based system applies is just over £26,000. That is not, to most people's definition, a high-skilled worker. And I represent a North Midlands town where the average wage is not particularly high. But my constituents would not consider that's bringing in the kind of cream of the crop, highly skilled people into the UK. So I can see a good argument for increasing that to something that is more akin to the median salary. I also think, to Madeline's point, there's a very large number of people coming in on the care visa route. It's 120,000, I think, in the last year, plus 120,000 dependents. It's a very large number of people, and that, I think, is something that needs careful attention. And, then there are other areas, like, for example, the ability to bring family members into the UK from around the world, even if you don't have the resources to actually look after those people, and the cost to the state and public services of supporting them. And so those are some of the areas that I'm personally interested in.
Matt, did you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, as we all know, I think mass migration has been used by politicians and policymakers as a short-term fix to long-term structural, deep-rooted problems in the country. We've never really had a grown-up debate, I don't think, in this country about why we've ended up here with a political economy that's based around importing cheap workers on salary thresholds, which sometimes go as low as £23,000 a year in some sectors, in order to maintain an economy that's based around consumption and prioritising the interests of big business over the interests of the national community. And as Lord Hodgson said, I mean, it isn't only about GDP. The point about demographic churn, to go back to David's point about permanent residence versus net migration, if you look at the literature on why people are concerned about migration, it is consistently the rate of change that drives concern over migration. So it's not so much the static level, it's the churn, the sense that my home, my country, is no longer a settled, stable place. It is constantly undergoing churn and change. And within that context, what are the areas that we could change? I mean, low-skilled migration is the obvious one. Voters have consistently been sort of misled on migration. The high-skilled policy, as the Minister essentially just said, isn't really that. Low-skilled migration is also the most unpopular among voters. It's a no-brainer to change. We need to do that while investing seriously in upskilling, reskilling British workers and British students, by the way. The failure to expand medical school places, the failure to invest in British kids to enter the NHS and medical schools simply because it was too expensive, so it was easier to import people from abroad, was one of the big policy failures in my mind over the last 20, 30 years. Often, by the way, people who are less skilled than British doctors and so on. Beyond low skill, international students and dependents, it's very easy to say international students are popular, and in some polling, that is true. But why are we taking the numbers that we're taking at the moment? We're doing that to prop up a higher education system which is no longer working in the way that it should. And I say that as somebody that works in the higher education sector. We're doing it largely, like we're doing in the economy with mass migration, we're doing it to cover up and conceal the glaring financial problems within the higher education sector, which has become inefficient, bloated, and is no longer really working the way it should. So it's easier, therefore, to import students to try and cover that up and keep the money coming in. The more interesting debate to have is how we can radically reshape higher education in this country, and also in a way that ensures British students and British kids are being prioritised within that sector. And I appreciate not everybody in the room would agree with me on that. And just lastly, illegal migration. Yes, I know we're talking about legal migration, but since 2018, we have 100,000 people who have entered the country illegally, nearly 50,000 over the last year. I consistently disagree with cabinet ministers over dinner who tell me that actually the only thing the Brits are concerned about is what's happening on the borders. It's illegal migration, it's not legal migration. I think in this room we've got a sort of consensus among the speakers that both forms really matter. But we have to, in the next year, seriously get on top of illegal migration, because that is really galvanizing intense public concern. Only yesterday, immigration replaced the economy as being the top issue for 2019 Conservative voters, which I also wrote about. So the salience of this issue is going up and up as we consistently fail to resolve the illegal migration issue, which essentially means having a viable deterrent and reforming our relationship with existing legal infrastructure, ECHR, Human Rights Act. And I appreciate, again, not everybody will agree with me, but based on what's coming and the experiences in Australia and elsewhere, and based on what our own National Crime Agency say, the only way we can get on top of that issue is if we have an active, consistent deterrent. So those are the things I would like to see us be discussing and debating: how we can change the political economy, how we can reform higher education, how we can raise the salary thresholds, have fewer low-skill migrants, and how we can resolve the crisis on the borders as quickly as possible. Those would be my priorities.
Thanks, good.
I would say that some of the weaknesses are we are far too ready to use the shortage occupation list. On that at the moment are carpenters and plumbers and electricians. We surely can, with effort, train enough people within this country to undertake those sorts of roles. And it feeds slightly into the point about Matt was making about higher education. There is, in my view, significant underemployment amongst our settled population in various ways. Young people on 0-hours contracts, members of the minority community locked into low-pay, low-prospect jobs, and above all, people aged over 50 who find it very hard to get a job at all. If you do some research in this, you'll find that they give up looking for work because they simply get to the last 5 and are always put to one side because people prefer to hire younger people. So there's a huge pool of people in this country who we could deploy and in that way reduce the demand for people from overseas. I can hardly believe this saying to you even now, but if you look at the ONS definition of employment, it's 1 hour's paid employment a week. Well, my calculation I have is 1 hour's paid employment a week, a true reflection. So we need to do some more work about that. We need to stop talking about average GDP per head. We need to talk about what the median wage is, the point at which half the country earns more and half the country earns less. And that figure has hardly moved in the last 10 years at all, which means a large proportion of our left-behind communities are getting poorer as a result of the policies we are following about low-skill, high-volume immigration. So I would like to see us a big manpower planning activity, which will lead to reduction in pressure on people to bring people in from overseas, and a focus. If you ask industrial psychologists, what do people go to work for? They go to work for money. They go to work for self-actualization. Am I going to improve as a person? Am I going to learn more as a person? And thirdly, for societal's reputation. When I go to the pub, will people say, that's an interesting job you're doing? Or will they say, oh, I didn't know you came from Romania? And so one's got to find a way to look much better at the management of our workforce as part of the way of rebalancing the structure, and in that way dealing with the very, very pressing problems that the poor old minister at the end is having to deal with.
As the panel fact checker, I'm not sure you're quite right about median income. I think median income has actually risen
Real terms?
surprisingly substantially, yeah. I mean, in the last 10 years, I think median income is now, correct me if there's an economist in the room, is now about 33,000, and it was about 28 a decade ago. Anyway, well, but that's not the subject of this discussion. So,
Real terms, I'm not sure you're right, but never mind.
Madeleine, did you have any thoughts on if you were Prime Minister, and you wanted to get re-elected and cut immigration, where would you cut?
Yes, well, I was going to say, these are political choices, so above my pay grade as a humble technocrat. But I think, obviously, as I mentioned, work and study are the areas that are most amenable to policy. study migration, I think, is interesting because obviously, the large majority of students in the past have tended to go home, and I agree that there could be some changes in that because of the change in the composition of the students. Although I would still expect it to be a majority leaving. But even if you have only sort of 10 to 20% of international students remaining permanently in the UK, when the number of students is so high, that's still actually a non-trivial contribution to net migration. So I think the students do contribute, particularly through, and the policy vehicle for that is the work visa route. I think there are probably some categories of work-related migration where the impacts are relatively small, and so sort of on the aggregate, there's some leeway to make policy choices in a more liberal or restrictive direction, depending to taste, as it were. The economics research tends to suggest that if you want to restrict somewhere, then from an economic perspective, it makes sense to do it on the lower wage end of the spectrum. So you'd be looking at things like the kind of shortage occupation list jobs, actually, where people are coming in on lower wages towards the lower end of what's possible, or even international students transitioning to work as new entrants in the labour market. But again, the biggest when you're talking about that group, the care worker route now is so large that's the sort of elephant in the room of all of this. And as others have mentioned, the whole thing hinges on your ability to resolve the long-standing problems in the social care workforce and the social care funding, which is something that political parties have been unable to do for quite a while now.
Good, thanks. I'll open it up in a sec. Just one. I agree very much with what you were saying, Matt, about higher education and student migration. But I do think you were a bit dismissive of this claim that people are not that anxious about student migration. That Sundar Katwala of British Future is sitting there, and I think you've done a fair amount of research that shows that. But also the point I would make is that students tend to live in certain parts of towns that have sort of, as it were, traditionally been student quarters, where there is high churn and people are not particularly anxious about that because indeed it's sort of part of the sort of tradition of the town. Oh yes, that's where the students live. There may be a few more of them, but that's not, I don't think, something that is sort of high up the list of people's anxieties compared, say, to low pay immigration.
No, I agree with you. Yeah. I don't think international students are unpopular in the realm of public opinion, but I do think international student migration is increasingly being used by universities to prevent them from dealing with the underlying challenges within the higher education sector. It's easier for my university to rely on international students than ask itself why it's in deficit and why the funding model is broken. And that's the reality of where we are. And many of those students, by the way, are not going to elite universities. Many of them are going to middle, low-tier institutions where the entry requirements are very low. So I know we have this narrative that there's this lovely form of migration that is, high-skilled and so on, and is contributing. The reality in many universities is actually quite different when you look at it on the ground.
Good. Okay. Well, let's open it up to comments and questions. Just tell us who you are, and then fire away. Sundar, as I've already mentioned you, you can have the first go.
Thanks, David. Sundar Katwala from British Future. How high is too high, and you all think it's too high? Then the subsequent question is, how low would you want to go with it in terms of overall numbers? It's probably net 400, if it wasn't for Ukraine and Hong Kong as a sort of stable state, which is more than the net 250 you started with in this parliament. So that's the bit that is Boris Johnson's policies on care and NHS visas and student visas and post-study leave. So do the panel think getting it below the net 250 before the general election is sort of in scope and is something that people expect, or would it take longer? The New Conservatives have put out a plan. And is that where you're trying to take it, or are you trying to get back to the net 100,000? Reform proposed net zero Is net zero sort of getting the balance wrong, or is net zero something you think about as well?
The other net zero, yeah. Well, actually, let's do that, and then I'll come back and we'll take two or three together. But I think that is sort of quite a good chunky question. How low?
Well, I think it's probably not productive to get hung up on a particular number. The key thing is to see a substantial and sustained reduction, which is what we haven't had in recent years. What I'm concerned about is the consequence of some of those decisions that were made immediately after we left the European Union, which turned out to be significant liberalisations of the present system, and in some cases quite naive about the consequences in terms of numbers. So I think there are reforms to be done which will unwind some of that. As you say, we've made a substantial one already with respect to student dependence. There are others that could be done. We've just discussed some of the potential options. The change won't happen overnight. That's not the nature of migration. It'll take time for any one of those policy changes to take effect. But I think it's both the right thing to do economically and also politically. The public are looking to us to make those changes, and so that we are beginning to bring down net migration.
Quick one, Matt, Lord Hodgson.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is obviously hypothetical. I mean, we're not going to... It's nice maybe to think that we're going to have a significant and sustained reduction, but I suspect we're not. I suspect, if anything, the predictions will be wrong, as they have been for the last 20 years. Almost all of the estimates that were made by the ONS and civil servants since 1997 have been wrong. I mean, it's true. I list them all in my book if you're interested. Consistently, we've underestimated migration flows, which is why I suspect we will again. So I'd like to see a temporary pause, bringing net migration to sort of around 100,000, maybe less, for a period of time, simply so the country can fully absorb and integrate the changes that have happened over the last 20 years. We have never done this before. This is a new experiment in the history of our country. And as I say, contrary to much of the hysteria last week after Suella Braverman's comments, it is immediately obvious to anybody who lives in small towns in northern England that we still have a problem with integration and cohesion in this country. And if you don't think that, come and speak to me afterwards and I can tell you some towns and neighbourhoods to go and visit. So we have not, we do not have an unequivocally positive experience with the changes that were introduced over the last 20 years. So I would like to see a pause since 1997, a pause after this experiment, so that we can better integrate and better manage the population and the changes before we then revisit the question of what is an appropriate level. We are the only Western democracy today without a successful anti-immigration party. Okay, and that, I suspect, is a temporary feature of our politics. And if we want to go back into division and polarization and all the rest of it, then keep migration levels where they are, have a Labour government, get rid of the illegal migration bill, don't have a deterrent, talk about safe and legal routes with no upper limits, and then politically we can all watch what happens. Or we can get real about where we are and ensure that we have an active, proactive framework and get ahead of what is coming over the next 10, 20, 30 years. So I'd like to see a serious, sustained pause.
Okay, we're going to skip Lord Hodgson, and this is too political for Madeleine anyway, so we're going to let you off. But we do have the former Australian immigration minister here, and you wanted to make a quick... I haven't forgotten about there are three of you that I have my eye on as well.
Foreign Minister.
Sorry, Foreign Minister.
Yeah.
But with
High Commissioner.
With responsibility for immigration. With responsibility for immigration.
Some responsibility. Yeah. So I'm the chairman of Policy Exchange. I'm flattered that people quote Australia as an example of running a very good immigration policy with particular reference to small boats issues and so on. But the one fundamental difference between Australia's immigration policy and the UK's is that Australia caps the number of migrants to come every year. So it sets a quota, a total of, say, 200,000, so quite high figures. And then they have within that a quota for skilled migration, a quota for family reunion, a quota for refugees, refugee resettlement, essentially those three categories. Every time I've asked this question in the UK, and I've listened to the discussion you've been having now about numbers of migrants, I have found total resistance to the idea of the government setting a cap for the number of migrants and working out the cap through discussions with industry and government departments and so on. I would have thought that would solve the problem quite quickly and is likely to be very popular with the public.
Robert, do you agree?
Well, we created an Australian points-based system. It was neither Australian nor points-based. So there's definitely an argument to take a look at the idea of a cap. I mean, much as though I love the Home Office, I am nervous about the idea of the Home Office choosing a cap and dictating to every sector of society how many workers can come in. That does seem quite risky to me, and quite a statist approach. But you're right. I'm not opposed to the idea of a cap. Is the honest answer. I think there are arguments for it, and it does cut to the basic question of how many people do you think is sustainable and gets you a quick solution when all other forms of intervention are inherently very uncertain. We are doing that in one limited respect now, which is for safe and legal routes. So we legislated in the summer to say that safe and legal routes will continue, but to a capped level, and that cap will be set not by the virtue signalling of politicians in Westminster, but the capacity of local authorities to house and to properly integrate people into our society. So it re-grounds the policy in the reality in our local communities. And in fact, we were about to consult on that and ask every local authority in the country, well, how much capacity do you have? And some may come back and say they have no capacity. And that is not a bad outcome to me. That's just the truth. You know, be honest with us about what your capacity is. And there may well be lessons from that to have a broader application.
Okay, I do want to bring some other people in. The guy in the white suit.
Mr. Chairman, I'm Abdul Mateen from the Isle of Wight Conservative Association. I'm an immigrant myself. My family come from Bangladesh, and I wanted to be a part of British society, and that's the reason why I'm here. And I was going through Manchester yesterday, and there's a part of Manchester where there are no English people living, it's all immigrants. Now, people who wish to come and associate and live in our country should wish to be British and not wish all the British to become like them. So I want an United Kingdom with English people living in all parts of their cities. And equally, I would like the immigrants who fleeing poverty should not feel they can leave Germany and France and come to United Kingdom as a place so that they can live in comfort, risking their family and their children on a ship crossing.
Good points. But
and
let's get some more people in. Thank you.
Thank
good
you.
points. Well, actually, man to your right. Yeah.
Ewan Cameron. Matt, I would agree. I think we're at the start of a huge wave of demand. Bless you. I work in Africa. If you fast forward to 2050, 25% of the world's population is going to come from that continent. When I speak to Africans today, that's a very generalisation, so I speak to Zambians, Zimbabweans, Mozambicans. Quite often they talk about relatives, siblings that have travelled into Europe and have come to the UK. So I'm interested in politics. I say to them, well, why are they in the UK? Well, when we go to Portugal, we go to Spain, we go to France, actually we get a lot tougher time There'll be inspectors that come to the workplace. They'll challenge us as employees as well as our employers. It's very uncomfortable. Easy access to housing? No. Easy access to public services? No. For immigrants, it's a lot easier to come to the UK versus those other countries I've mentioned. So then you then ask the question about enforcement. What are we doing with regard to enforcement, with regard to our employers? You know, there's research to say there could be 1.2 million illegal immigrants in the UK, and maybe on a quarterly basis just now, we're prosecuting, 500? So that says to me that there's a body of belief that it's easier to work here illegally, and then secondly, you've got employers who are exploiting that economically, which is obviously a disadvantage of employers that don't break the law.
Yeah. We do need a beefed up labour. What's it called? The labour whatnot scheme. Labour. Mobility. No, people who go into factories and check. What's it called? You know, labour inspectorate.
Yeah,
Labour inspectorate.
we are actually doing that, David.
Oh, good.
I mean,
Yeah.
The number of raids on illegal employers has increased by 50% this year alone, and we've massively hiked all of the fines.
Yeah.
So there is a lot of work going on.
Guy over there.
Hello, Jim Dickinson from One Key. Regardless of when they leave and regardless of the number of dependents, when we issue a study visa, students assume that they will be able to access somewhere to live of a reasonable price, reasonable quality and reasonable distance from campus. Last academic year and this academic year, the evidence is that they can't. Whose fault is that, and whose responsibility should it be to avoid that in the future?
So we don't have enough student accommodation in student areas. Right. There was a guy at the back there. Wait for the mic to come. Make it quick so I can get in.
I'll be very quick.
Yeah.
Andrew Boff from London. I'm interested that we're going to be driven entirely by the polls, in which case I'm looking forward in the manifesto for us to nationalising the railways, because that too is supported by the British public, but I don't think the Conservative Party will do it. I'm interested because state targets for housing have completely failed. State targets for migrants has completely failed. We have the professor arguing, giving us a treatise against capitalism because he thinks big business is so bad. And we have the noble lord arguing that there should be state regulation of private vacancies. I mean, I'm looking forward to the small state conservatism if this goes through, to be honest. And all three of you, a government minister, a professor and a lord, they're not elite. People like me are elite who actually quite see the value of migration. Isn't it time that we abandoned state regulation and started to talk about allowing the free market to rip? Because what you're talking about from up on the high table there, you're talking about how you can constrain the market, how you can restrict freedom, how you can stop people getting the opportunities that they need. I've never met an immigrant I didn't like, and I live in an area of London where I am one of those people, the only white face in my street, and I absolutely value it. And I think, short of, the professor, I expected him to finish off his arguments with England awake. This is appalling stuff. We should celebrate immigration. We should celebrate what new British people are bringing to this country. In London we celebrate, which is why we
I think we can.
In London we celebrate, which is why we end up paying for the rest of the country.
I think we can celebrate, but also want restriction. A guy there, couple more. Well, we're gonna have to stop in a sec.
So the birth rate in this country has been substantially lower than is required to replace the population for about 50 years now. And most industrialized countries are in the same boat. My question is it necessary to have immigration, maybe mass immigration, to make up for this shortfall in natural population growth?
Okay, final one, blue shirt guy there, and then quick final comments from everybody, and then we can all go home.
Hello, I'm Nick Stiliano from Sky News. I was just wondering what the panel thinks of the intrinsic link between illegal migration and legal migration. We're talking about 40,000 health and social care visas in the UK, letting dependents come over on care worker visas, and then perhaps claiming asylum once they get here, or actually failing to turn up for the workplace. And Professor Goodwin says the same hints at it in the student visa category. Visa overstayers, I wonder what the panel thought about the higher education sector making the target only being 90% of overseas students having to actually turn up to their course, and 85% of them who do turn up to their course only the completion rate only being 85%, and that being a huge kind of uncovered moment in our
All right, well,
story.
thank you. Let me just give the panel a very, very quick final word. By the way, good point that you raised. We tend to talk now as if the people coming over the channel on the boats are the only irregular entries. They're actually about half. About a quarter is still visa overstays, as you say, which means that, you know, even if the government was able to stop the boats, it's still incredibly important to have returns deals with countries, to be able to deport people in ways that we seem very poor at doing at the moment. So look, a final word. Well, let's start with Madeline. Did you have a quick final comment?
Sure, yeah, I'll just say something about the caps and the Australian system, which I think gets discussed a lot here. I would say I think in Australia the system works totally differently, and it's the caps or the targets of permanent residents in a system that is worker-driven rather than employer-driven, which is where caps tend to cause the least trouble. If you superimpose a cap on an employer-driven system for entry visas, that's where you get some of the chaotic problems that governments tend to want to avoid, like lotteries and backlogs. I think the broader point in caps is there's no reason you can't have them, but it doesn't allow you to escape making the actual decisions about where migration policy is going to be more or less restrictive. You know, are we going to fund social care to a level that makes people want to go and do those jobs? I think sometimes the caps, people act as if the cap solves the problem, whereas actually it's just it's superimposed on this broader system, but you still have to be able to make all of the same decisions that you would in a system without caps.
Good, thanks. Lord Hodgson.
Right. Well, first of all, for the gentleman at the back who was cross with us about attacking immigrants, as he saw it, it's not a question of no immigration. Immigrants bring a dynamic, a cultural and economic dynamic. It's a question of scale of the impact it's having. So that's the first question. Second question is, what is the purpose behind an immigration policy? It's to create circumstances in which the maximum number of our fellow citizens improve their standard of living and their quality of their life. And that's the real measure that we should be using. The numbers come as a result of that. And if we have a falling birth rate, some economists argue that actually a falling population is the most likely circumstances in which people will be better off because of the interest, productivity, and so on. And finally, with regard to my fact checker, but if we only have 100,000 people out of the 600,000 here permanently, but we have a permanent churn of people coming and going, they actually have the same impact on much of our public services as if they were here permanently. They're just different people each year making the demand.
Fair point. Matt, final word, and then Robert can have the very final word.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I attacked capitalism. I said that when it comes to migration, we have consistently prioritised the interests of big business over the interests of the national community. One of the things the Conservatives did after Brexit, which for few people know, is removing the requirement on companies to advertise jobs in Britain first, which I think was an interesting response to the Brexit vote. Let the free market rip. Yeah, I mean, that's a 3 to 5% position in the country. There's a former Prime Minister doing the rounds at this conference who will tell you how some of those policies went down in the country, and they didn't go down very well at all. Most people want to live in a national community with secure borders, with some immigration, reasonable levels of immigration, but which also values the importance of integration. And it's wonderful that your neighbourhood has that. Many areas in the UK do not have that. And maybe if you venture outside of London, I could take you to some of them. And lastly, on the birth rate issue, yeah, obviously we need to have some immigration. I don't think anyone on this panel has said we want zero immigration. But I do think we need to be able to talk much more in a more mature fashion about how we might tackle that issue through policy, through changing social norms, through investing in family development, through all of the things that many Conservatives elsewhere in the world are talking about, but we seem incapable as a country of talking about family policy without everybody losing their marbles. So I'd like to see a mature conversation about how we could encourage people to have children, how we could encourage families to have more children, how the state could play a role in that, and that would be a good initial start.
Perhaps Charles's Demographic Institute could set a target for more babies. Robert, final word.
Yes, well, I'd agree strongly with the last point about families. We do need to encourage more families to have children, and that's why the Prime Minister's intervention earlier in the year around childcare was important. That's why we need to build more homes so that young people can settle down and have a family life, and there's a lot of evidence that the lack of housing is one of the reasons people are settling down, having kids later on in life. I think the gentleman who mentioned student accommodation just reinforced the point that net migration does need to come down because it's having real world implications in communities right across the country, to the point where students are struggling to get the housing that they want in the university towns and cities that they want to settle in. And though they may be transient and some may leave the country, nonetheless it's placing unbearable pressure on our housing stock right now, and that's one of the many strong arguments for taking a stronger approach than we have in the recent past. On the interplay between small boats and the rest of the challenge, David is absolutely right that small boats is not the totality of the issue with illegal migration. It is the majority of people coming in illegally. Actually, the numbers coming in on HGVs have fallen very sharply as a result of this route opening up and as a result of the good work that's been done to make that much more inhospitable. But there are large numbers of people who come in perfectly legally on visas and then overstay, some of whom ultimately claim asylum, and that has to be a focus. And I'm very conscious that because the media is 100% focused on small boats, we in government shouldn't take our eye off the ball of all the other things that we would be thinking about were there not a small boats challenge. And as we get a grip on the small boats one, we don't see that move, as it always does, into other forms. And this year, remember, the number of people coming across on small boats has fallen by 25%. The last 2 months, the key months of the year, have been 40% less than September and August last year. So there are the first signs of progress as a result of the things we've been doing. So we've got to be super vigilant that that doesn't just evolve into other forms of illegal entry into the country. And just lastly, on the point that Andrew Boff was making, I would just say one thing related to that. Don't let anybody persuade you that this government, Conservative government, has somehow been mean-spirited when it comes to supporting people from around the world. Always remember that since 2015, 530,000 people have come into the UK for humanitarian reasons, whether that's from Hong Kong, Syria, Afghanistan, or on the global route that the UN run for us from any country or many countries around the world. And that is the biggest influx of people into this country on humanitarian grounds in this country's history, more than during the Second World War, more than in the 1930s, when we could have done more as a country, and certainly far more than the last Labour government did. And in Europe, we are second only to Sweden for resettlement schemes. And so we are one of the best countries in the world for helping people in genuine peril, genuine need of our support. And if we can get a grip of illegal migration, that'll only free up more capacity for us to do good in the world. But the problem today is that the small boats crisis is making it hard for us to be the compassionate country that we want to be and support people in real, genuine need.
Good. Well, that's it, folks. Thank you very much for coming, and a really good discussion.